Now we're a bit too close.
Good afternoon, Bojo, Anine. My name is Mike Alexander, and we have a wonderful guest here. We're going to be doing a little bit of chatting. This is Michael Yahgulanaas. Excellent, thank you very much. Before we do get underway, there's a couple of housekeeping things that I need to take care of. Number one, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded, which is stolen, homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And that's customary to say. I want to sort of add that I'm originally from Treaty Number 1 territory back in southern Manitoba. And so I'm an absolute guest on these territories. And it's been the folks out here have been very kind to me and very welcoming and very warm. This is a great place of healing for me on a personal level. And so I'm trying to develop a connection to the land and to the water and to the people here as I kind of learn more about kind of where I'm situated. And I think that's important for all of us to do here on these folks' territory. So that's kind of what I wanted to say about the land. I want to thank a few sponsors, specifically the Canada Council for the Arts, the Canada Heritage Fund, BC Gaming, Creative BC, the City of Vancouver, DBVIA, the Hamber Foundation, the Joseph Wask Foundation, the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop, Sewell, Pace and Associates, the Federation of BC Writers, the League of Canadian Poets, the Writers Union of Canada, and of course, Surrey Public Library for hosting us today. If you want to check out the full list of partners, please visit the Word Vancouver website. Without you, this free festival could not happen. And if you haven't already, please consider making a donation to the festival via the website. So with that out of the way, Michael Nicoll Yahgulanaas is a visual artist, author, and mischief maker, which I can't wait to find out about. His art lives in public spaces and private collections around the world, including the British Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, the Seattle Art Museum, the Museum of Anthropology at UBC, and Vancouver Art Gallery. His work has been transformed into an opera, The Flight of the Hummingbird, for which he was the librettist and designer. And a new full-length version of this production is currently in the works for a wider audience. He's also at work on a commission for the Vancouver Art Gallery. His publications include Flight of the Hummingbird, Red, Haida Manga, Carpe Fin, and War of the Blink. In 2021, UBC Press published a catalog of his work, Mischief Making, Michael Nicoll Yahgulanaas, Art and the Seriousness of Play by Dr. Nicola Level. His most recent book is the critically acclaimed Jage, published by Douglas and McIntyre in 2023. Yahgulanaas creates art inspired by almost 4 decades of political experience in the Council of the Haida Nation, a decade as a trustee for a philanthropic foundation, and an upbringing in a lineage of accomplished artists and hereditary leaders. He's traveled extensively through a wide geography of diverse Indigenous, pastoral, and resilient communities, brimming with curiosity and ideas, he carries a traveler's ticket in one hand and a sketchbook in the other. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Yahgulanaas.
I better get the sketchbook. I don't have the traveling ticket, but I'm here. A little bit late. Thanks for waiting.
No worries. I'm pleased to meet you. This is a first for me. I don't even get to meet a whole lot of authors in my life. So it's really cool to be able to sit here with you today. And so I think primarily we are to discuss the latest book that was published, Jaj. And first off, is there anything that you'd want to sort of say about the book as a whole?
Well, thanks for the introduction, first of all. That was a long introduction, so somebody probably in the studio wrote it up, or maybe Douglas and McIntyre, but if it had gone much longer, we'd probably be asking for questions now.
Yeah, no
But
doubt.
it's a good one, but I appreciate it. Sorry for being
It's a lot of, you've done
mischief.
a lot of stuff.
Jaj, so is there anyone in here that speaks Hindi? No, maybe online. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but it's a Hindi word that means discernment. You know, sort of the element of judgment, making a good judgment on the basis of actually being able to see the situation. And it's also the initials of one of the main characters in this book, Jaj. That character is Johan Adrian Jacobson. And the other character in there is George, and he's my great-grandmother's father, who disappeared in 1892 in Japan. And the story, the official story was he was lost at sea. The unofficial story is that he actually fell in love with a woman in Hakodate in northern Japan and engineered his apparent loss at sea and never came home. So there's a lot of things to think about from a personal sort of family thing. But anyways, the story of Jaj is to look at the lives of George and the lives of Johan Adrian Jacobson, a Norwegian in the service of a German institution, and to see them less as tropes like the bad great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, or the nasty European collector. And as I was starting to pull this book together, which is basically this painting behind me, this mural, the news flash was, I have Norwegian ancestors, and that they actually live in a town immediately next to where Johan Adrian Jacobson comes from. So I was forced, it was sort of like the big finger came out of the sky and said, you shall look at this in a different and more complex way than you initially were going to. So it's about personal discernment as well.
I picked that up maybe halfway or within the first half of the book when I realized that the narrator, perhaps you as the narrator, were speaking kindly to the reader, you know, not so much of an accusatory sort of like, this is how first contact happened and I don't like it because this and this happened, but sort of like, I sort of felt like people are being drawn in, like the reader is being drawn in to sort of listen to the story of maybe some of the commonalities between the two people.
Yeah, that's not only evident when you look at some of the, when you look at the life of Johan Adrian Jacobson, who is a Norwegian, didn't speak German very well, was certainly not connected to the elite people in Berlin who financed his voyage, but he was a sailor and they needed a sailor. They needed somebody who could actually get here, get the stuff and get back. As part of Germany's, I mean, Germany was only, let's see, Germany was 1872, I think, or 1876 when it sort of was created. So they wanted to be as big as the British and as big as the Americans. So there was this hunger, and they really needed him, and they played him along. They didn't treat him very nicely. So, aside from that, sort of pulling at my heartstrings a little bit and having sympathy for this person, also in my own life growing up in Macedon, Haida, and sort of straddling between an Indigenous community and a settler community, I was privy to observe the relationships between people, which are frequently based on ethnicity, and my skin complexion, and the fact that I was a non-status, which is not so common now, but it's sort of like you're not Canadian and you're not Indian, you're sort of nobody really wants you kind of thing. I was always observing these relationships and started to develop a lot of sympathy for both sides of that culture clash, given my European roots with a grandfather who was Scottish grandfather, and my Haida family, and so I could never pick one or the other, and so I was forced right from a young age to find myself in the middle. And there's a lot of people at home like that. And I think there's a lot of people in that sort of non-status community who were really had to calibrate out, how do we fit into our society? Who's our community? Essentially, who is our tribe? And I think my observation is that most of the people in that area have this compassionate view. As we try to work through reconciliation, the danger is that we have to make a good guy and a bad guy. And I think that's been the problem all along. And if we don't break through that veil, we're probably going to not do as good a job as we might otherwise do.
Thank you for that. It's really interesting, and I've been thinking about using commonality as a sort of mechanism to describe, first contact, just because it tends to be, again, adversarial. But I guess what you're talking about is going to be, how do we draw out, people's histories, looking at, individual sort of perspectives on identity as being part of that search.
Yeah, ultimately, it's all personal, isn't it? I mean, in your opening remarks, and you're acknowledging that this, according to Canadian law, let me just say it that way, according to Canadian Constitution, this land is not the property of the province of British Columbia or the Canadian government. Essentially, if you just apply the law, in the absence of a treaty, the Constitution says it's not yours, baby. And that's just the reality. But for most of us, because we are benefiting from the current situation, we're okay with it. But that's a personal decision. We can avoid it and just pretend it's not there, and you go whistling in the dark, and that's a choice. The other choice is, if we decide to engage in that question in an intimate way, in a personal way, we actually have the capacity to change the situation. But because we're okay with it, then the province is okay with it, more or less. Not entirely. There's a lot of progressive change going on. Canada is okay with it, more or less. But things don't change unless we make a stink. And here's the thing about it, that just in other parts of the world right now, people are shooting, killing, bombing, doing horrific assaultive, violent things for issues that are not dissimilar to issues here in Canada. And we have the opportunity to do it in a far more evolved way. And I think generally, notwithstanding residential schools and all that sort of horror, the opportunity to do it in a different, better way is here. And it's not just for the life of Indigenous peoples or Indigenous lands that we do this. It's for the other. It's for ourselves. With Aboriginal title and rights, we can address every element of our societal structure. We can talk about in environmental concerns. We can talk about legal matters. We can talk about mining, resource extraction, democracy, because it contains all those things. If someone has title and rights to the land, it's not just the right to sort of sit in a corner and or to be a small part of the picture. It's huge, it's foundational. Through that, we can actually start to rejigger some of the problems that we have in the structure of this country, such as homelessness, the fact that a single mother is getting a welfare payment that isn't even enough for her to take the bus to the hospital to take her child in. What are the grievances that we have as Canadians, and where is the tool we're going to take to improve and change the structure? And I suggest that the tool is Aboriginal title and rights. It's good, it can be good for all of us. Percy Gladstone, he's dead a long time ago. He went off to war in the Second World War, Lancaster bomber, navigator, came back totally physically uninjured, came back. This first day he got back, he was in a car accident and he was crippled for the rest of his life. But he once said, Aboriginal title and rights, or as we called it, the land question then. And I was like, just a punk kid pushing him around in a wheelchair for a couple of days, that the settlement of that would mean that people didn't have to pay mortgages like regular Canadians. That's how substantial and how foundational and how vast the question is. Anyways, I better stop because I was going to get into chapter 2 of the rant, but basically it's this huge unexplored treasure box that benefits everyone who is a Canadian.
It's neat that you sort of say that, just because I think at some point in the book you refer to, I guess, new Canadians or as refugees fleeing Europe kind of thing. And I think that's a really important way to sort of look at people who came here as far as finding commonality is concerned. We aren't all that different when it comes down to it.
Yeah, the question somewhere in that mural behind me, and it's so confusing to me, even though I painted it, I don't know if I could find it, and I couldn't tell you chapter and verse, but it was this realization that came to me that millions of Europeans fled Europe to come to North America. I mean, there was inducements, there were promises of opportunity, but they didn't come because life was so good for them at the other end. The feudal structure, I mean, what was going on in Berlin in the 1880s is you'd have, I think, excuse me if I don't have the figures quite right because my brain doesn't work that way, 13 people living in a 12 square meter space was considered appropriate housing. The tensions that, okay, well, here's a good example. Karl Marx is working on his manifesto at that time. There was serious unrest in Germany. The tensions between the landowners and the serfs is breaking open and people are fleeing and coming here. They're refugees. They're refugees from a system that really doesn't give a hoot about them. And our job here is to make sure that when these refugees came over and when we, the European side of us, came here, we did not import the same feudal structure. And I think there's some evidence out there, I'll let other people speak to it, that we have inherited a significant amount of that feudal system in terms of how privilege and financial privilege and economic and political power really gravitates to a very small group of us. And it is not like in a Haida government system, your position as the highest ranking person is your ability to feed the people. And here's a little interesting thing. The highest ranking position possible for a man in village government in Haida Gwaii is to be called a mother. That's the translation of the term, Lanas Au, town mother. And it is the measure of that, a person's ability to govern is to inspire and to nurture and to love the people. And we don't necessarily have that here. Anyways, that was another rant.
No worries. You're here to rant for a good another half hour. So it's totally
Okay.
appreciated.
Okay.
But I do like I don't know an awful lot about Haida government, Haida culture, Haida art kind of thing. I'm an outsider kind of looking in for sure, and will be doing so for the rest of my days. But since you're here, I want to sort of shift just a bit and sort of ask a couple of questions about the innovation of Haida art. I think that there's a few things that sort of spring to people's minds, generally speaking, specifically with formline when it comes to considering Haida art. And what I'm looking at, you know, behind me here is has its roots in some of that, but it's certainly I'm using the word innovation because I've heard you say it, and I'm just sort of wondering, like, how does Haida how does Haida governments or artists or what have you use innovation to tell Haida stories?
So what Mike is referring to is something I call the tradition of innovation. So there is tradition, but tradition is actually innovation. And we sort of lock it into tradition, and sometimes we feel it's sort of stuck in a moment. And I think that's not right. It's not true. And so I just remind myself by talking about the tradition of innovation. So on Haida Gwaii, there's a couple of really important trade items that we don't have. We have to trade for, including like olekins, for instance, which is a high value food source because it comes in the early spring. It's highly desirable. Anyways, I won't go into too much in that. And then there's mountain goat furs. And then there's just relationships with people in Canada, because we're actually outside the territorial sea of Canada. We're 27 miles off the beach. And so we have stories about creating art. They're really foundational stories, and they're not like mythic stories. They're basic says that family at this time did that thing, and that thing happens to be totem poles. So we've created an iconic visual language. And in order to sort of facilitate trade with our neighbors, we would look at our neighbors and anticipate what their narratives are. What are the important things for our neighbors in Canada, and create artworks, beautiful objects that were highly desirable and could make the transition between language and culture. In other words, they were hot items. And so they garnered a lot of value in the economic structure. And I do the same thing in terms of my art. I want to create messages or art, let me just say that speaks to people who are different ethnicity, different culture, different language, who don't necessarily understand it in the way that I bring to bear on it. And I'm able to do that because the sort of technical processes involved in creating Haida art are significant. And we look at it and say, wow, I don't know why it works, but it feels really good. So we're lucky to inherit that tradition. And how we innovate is how do we express it in a way that it has value and is appreciated by people who are non-Haidas. One of the ways that I remind myself that this is my job is to create works that break through the veil, break through the cleavages, is by using the term Haida Manga. And that is speaking back to earlier note I shared with you about the great-grandfather who disappeared in Japan. One of the reasons why he disappeared in Japan was at that time, Japan was very welcoming place, a place of refuge for Indigenous people along the coast. It was a god-awful time to be here with the British. You know, the loss of 90% through the smallpox that James Douglas closed his eyes to, that Dr. Helmkin and George Smith and Pemberton, and Burnaby, Robert Burnaby, all these guys really used smallpox to target Haidas, and then all the indigenous peoples from Bella Coola into the Chilcotin. The reason they were targeting that area was because Robert Burnaby thought he was going to build a road from the interior to the coast there, but he had to get rid of the indigenous peoples. So they used smallpox. So you can just imagine in this room or wherever you are, if you can just imagine 10 people that you know, or 9 people that you know, and then just imagine how is life with them suddenly just gone, and it's just you. I mean, the traumatic impact is significant. Japan, you could go working on sailing ships. Good mariner cultures along the coast meant it was sort of an easy ticket to get a job on a ship, and you would be traveling around the North Pacific, pelagic seals, whaling, just, you know, goods and traffic going back and forth between Asia and North America. And Haida men would be in Japan and go, oh my goodness, I can go into a restaurant here. I can go buy a new shirt. I can walk down the street and nobody's on my case. Here, if there was a toilet, it was an Indian toilet, and often there's stories of people traveling along ships where they were not allowed to use the toilets. So they had to wait all day to defecate over the sides of the ships. I mean, it was just the racism here. Even in Prince Rupert, there was a sign and this is in more recent times, in the early 50s perhaps, signs on cafes saying, no Indians, no dogs. And at that time, the only cafe which is still there in Prince Rupert is Smiles Cafe, and you could go in there, even if you were Indigenous. And so I always tell people, if you're in Rupert, go down to Cow Bay, go to Smiles Cafe. So all I'm saying is that the racism here was so gut-wrenching, terrible, that Japan ended up as this possibility to live a life as a full human. And so then I thought, okay, Haida, Manga, and this is how I'm going to explain this tradition of innovation, how I'm applying it here to these large paintings, which also are books. But I'll stop right there and pass it back.
Thank you. So yeah, I was the kid growing up on like DC and Marvel kind of thing. So I've got a background in, you know, comics per se. And my daughter has gone through a phase of manga herself and illustrates a little bit in her spare time with these days. But what is your relationship with the art form?
Well, it's probably peripheral, because for me, when I was starting to embark on taking the classic icons and some of the narratives and transferring it into something that was populist based, such as comics. I mean, they're just, doesn't matter your education, doesn't even matter if you speak the language, doesn't matter if you're underemployed or very wealthy, whatever, you can still read it. Accessibility is wonderful. I just didn't want it to be Haida comic books. I didn't want it to be, I'm overreaching here, but I didn't want it to be like a Marvel comic or an Archie comic or you know, any of those things. I was saying this is different. This is different, and so I reached back into that sort of Haida Japanese historical experience to find that, and then also just the translation of the word manhwa or manga is art without, or the line, art without boundaries. So it's kind of like this wide open welcome mat at the door. But so it's not so much about, I've been to Japan a number of times, and this mural we see behind us is one of I've forgotten. I think there's 3 out there. They're quite large. The 12 square meter paintings on Japanese paper, on washi, which is made out of mulberry. And the reason I picked that paper is because it's such an amazingly strong surface. These long mulberry fibers, so it's very resistant to tear and damage. And I've seen some of the papers that are probably arguably 400 to 600 years old, and they still look bright and crisp. So I go to Japan to pick out my papers. There is a family, the Kubota family on Western Honshu, that make the paper. It's a small family because the sheets are so large. So if I can just say about the size of these things, my 12 square meters or 8 square meters, they're huge. And when we get in front of them, you're kind of looking at it and you're trying to figure out, what am I looking at? Because there's no words. I realized that in my effort to make art that was populist, I had put myself into a trap where I'm creating large pieces of work that are not generally accessible. Because, I mean, who in the room, and particularly in Vancouver, has got 12 square meter wall that you can put a painting on? You know, it just doesn't exist anymore. So then that came in the magic of making it a book. And that's where I started to work with Douglas and McIntyre to take this piece behind me, and it's kind of hard to see, but there's little squares in there, and each one of those squares is a page in the book. So there's 108 units there in that painting. And the underlying thinking behind that is, rather than us always being subject to that which is monumental, be it institutions, architectural structures, urban landscapes, where we feel we fit in as a small little part, with a book, you can actually be in control of the story. You can read it any which way you want. You can read it upside down if you want. You can read it backwards. You can stop. You're in control. So it's almost like a reminder that we're citizens and we do count. We are important as individuals. And so there's the mural in a book form. And I brought one with me. And this is, if there's librarians here, with apologies, I do recommend that people take 2 copies of the book and cut it up. Because each one of these pages exists in the mural. And if you have 2 copies of the book, you can cut each page out and you can actually piece together your own mural. So you don't have to do the whole mural. You only might have 4 square meter wall. Well, maybe you want to make a 4 square meter wall with part of the mural. And we've printed this in the back, so you've always got the sort of how-to. And so, yeah, I've lost the question in that rambling.
I get lost in that because I'm just pretty impressed, and I really like the process of how this came to be. That mulberry paper, did I see video of you painting carpe fin on that paper? It looked pretty big.
Yeah. The 1 by 2 meter sheets.
Yeah.
And so I was over in Japan, and I found this paper, and I was really impressed and so happy that I could get these large sheets. And I'm flying back to Vancouver with these sheets of paper. I'm just so proud of myself. You know, whoa, I've really scored something. Halfway across the Pacific, I realized, oh my God, I don't have a table big enough to put this paper on. So then I'm starting, you know, the last part of the trip is I'm sort of hanging my head and feeling what a fool. So I get here, and I have a neighbor who's a industrial designer, and we designed this 1 by 2 meter table. And because it's so large, it's often difficult to access certain parts of it. So Anton has created this table that I can actually spin 360 degrees, and it goes up and it goes down, and it's just an amazing structure. Well, by the time I paid him in a few dollars and a lot of artwork, when I translated that to a figure, this table's probably worth about 10 grand. And again, to illustrate how my mind doesn't always work in logical ways, my friend Chris, who's a very practical person, a mariner, he said to me when I explained to him that the problem was I couldn't move or, access all parts of the table, he said, well, couldn't you have just walked around the edges of the table? And honestly, it hadn't even occurred to me. I just got myself into this little chasm and proceeded along that way, and not very practical. A lot of innovation, but not really thinking it right through to the end all the time.
But you have to have it your way.
Oh, geez. Yeah, I know, it's kind of embarrassing. Yeah.
Talk to me, if you can, about like innovation within the context of Haida culture. Specifically, like, how does this end up being like traditional is this traditional? Is this contemporary? Is this modern? What are folks looking at when they're looking at the whole book as a mural?
So you'll see the black lines, the black frame lines that contain the narrative elements that are. So Haida design, typically it's one of the primary characteristics of Haida design. Is this undulating line, this expanding, compressing thread that joins all the parts together. And the way that I interpret that is, we can imagine that we're inside a comic book right now, and here's the frame. It's this room, or it's the screen that you're watching, and everything that's really relevant is contained here in this space. You and I are right here. We're the story. We could depict this quite easily, and say this is the narrative. What Haida design says is, yes, this is true, but you can't forget there's a context, and that context is the frame line, that outside this room or outside this screen, there is a whole world going on. And outside the city, outside this world, there's a cosmos of things that are happening, and we don't even see most of them. So the frame line, to me, sort of ties all the elements together. There's a fulsome story, but it has a context that's outside of the little moment, but it impresses itself upon us. We wake up, we had a bad sleep, we have a bad day. That frame line is big and heavy, and it pushes down on us, makes us feel small and injured. And then we have a good sleep, we have a good day. That frame line is small. It's a small thread out in the corner, and we can feel expansive. And so it creates this tension, this rhythm that we're part of. And I think our danger in us as a species is we have imagined there is no frame line. We've imagined it's my story, our story, whatever we want to do, fine and dandy, let's do it. And it's this kind of swagger that has got us in this situation that we're in, which it's hard to sort of overstate how serious it is. And that's us that did that. And so I think it's maybe we could consider the frame line, which is the relationships we have not only to the greater world, but also to individuals and individual moments that seem to just pass us by. Like, can we say hello to people? Can we even smile when, instead of eyes sort of rolling off someone that we casually glance our eyes with, can we not smile? Can we not improve that frame line in that narrative, that relationship between the personal narrative and the frame line? And again, it's a call for individuals to do this. This isn't something that could be institutionalized. It doesn't work. Yeah, so.
I mean, it's interesting to sort of see that the conventions of what I imagine a, comic book or graphic novel are just totally erased. Like there's no 6-panel or 9-panel sort of narrative happening in what you're doing here. And I guess that sort of goes back to the idea that manga is sort of rebelling against the idea of rules.
Yeah, it's like all art is, I think, could be, should be, I'm not sure. It should be ever expansive and ever open to new concepts. We're seeing big significant changes in the comic world, and a lot of them, I think we'd have to look for a seed coming out of the University of Oregon, where Joe Sacco then came up with a term called comic journalism. And comic journalism, when you hold up the image, you see the hand of the person, the artist. You cannot pretend it doesn't exist. When I do this work, I have to stand up and I have to own it. I get to pick the line, the color, the narrative, everything. It's really honest projection of myself. The danger, there is a danger looking at the world through a screen. We have a reporter coming up, we have the camera looking at a situation, and the camera is saying to us, pretend I'm not here. Pretend this is really true, that you're looking at this. But the camera has a particular point of view. It's this filter that exists, and it's seductive, but it's not true. There is no objective eye here. When we look at the situation, it is a subjective relationship that we have to one another, to the frame line, and to each other. We can't pretend that we're objective. I think we need to be a little bit more honest about that. And comic journalism allows that. When you look at Joe Sacco's work, let's say on Gaza, it's through his eyes. And he's saying, I own it. This is how I see it. And some or other, it's like an anchor. It's true. I don't necessarily have to agree with Joe, but I can say that's Joe's position, and it forces me to make a decision whether or not I accept it. But I think with the camera, for me, it just feels, if I'm watching a movie and someone's going to say, well, that should have been this way or that way, and I also have to say, it's just fabricated. It's written, it's scripted, it's presented in a particular way. And I think that comics always says that. It is scripted and it's fabricated. And it's not necessarily real, but it's a valid opinion of some person.
You mentioned in Judge specifically mentioning how Jewish folks had been instrumental in sort of at least bringing awareness to what was happening with smallpox and its impact on, coastal nations in particular, which reminded me of the fact that, like, this is me, but like Superman was a character created by a couple of Jewish folks whose, story sort of could mirror Jewish experiences on some level, but what I realized as well could also mirror indigenous sort of realities and reflections of what it was like to be indigenous, being, feeling like from a different planet, potentially orphaned or, taken away from one's family, one's culture, one's world kind of thing. And I realized, like, for as fun and, silly as comics often get the reputation of being, there's some really serious and really, really good sort of work being done by people who are actually really thoughtful and creative and able to sort of channel those energies into these little narratives that speak to, as you were saying at the very beginning, people of all ages and all backgrounds and all sort of places in this world.
Yeah, just to this historical fact that in 1862, when Dr. Helmken and Pemberton and Burnaby and the ilk were using the single case of smallpox and then inoculating people like Francis Poole and spreading and sending them out. I mean, it's well documented by Tom Swanky, Swanky. He's a lawyer, he's done the research. It's valid research, and he's got the evidence that this is what happened. The smallpox was actually used. So the only people of record that spoke out against this were Jewish merchants in Victoria. And I'm thinking 1862, Jews are getting murdered in Poland and in Russia. And they have the strength of character to stand up against the British governor and that whole society and say, don't be killing people. I'm struck by that. And it reminds me that that when the waves of economic immigrants came from Europe to North America, they were not heralded in the street and loved up. I mean, we have all sorts of nasty words for Italians or Polish people or Swedish people or Spanish people. There's a whole lot of nastiness that we can direct on the basis of ethnicity. And so if that's the commonality, and I haven't even listed all our relatives from Asia and the insults that are heaped upon them. If that's the commonality, if that's the evidence, what's the common thread? The common thread is it's not about ethnicity. It's about class. It's about economic privilege and maintaining that. And I think that this, there was this fear in the United States that saw the murder of Black Panthers by the Los Angeles police, or the Wounded Knee massacre, and the still imprisonment of Leonard Peltier on very not on good grounds, charged with the murder of Anime Aquash, or the pushback against the Chicanos. This all comes out of the United States at the same time, and the reason for that was because these social movements which are happening in ethnic communities, if they had combined together, would be a political force that could probably really challenge the primacy, not sure if I just made up a word there, of the Democrats and the Republican parties. I mean, it was a new political force, and there's counter-telpol, I'm sorry, I can't remember. Is that it? Yeah, the FBI program to actually to place agents in the Black Panther movement and in the Wounded Knee as well, people that were agitating from inside and sort of really driving those social movements into extreme actions that could then justify their erasure by the state. Sorry, I'm wandering right off again, but it really makes the point that ethnicity, diversity of ethnicity, is not the problem. It never has been the problem, and it just diverts us away from the real problem, which is the structure of the inherited feudal-like system that we've willingly applied here. And for one of the world's oldest confederate or models, Canada, with a constitution and a confederation of provinces and a crown that is split between the feds and the province, and perhaps Aboriginal people to a certain extent, there is an opportunity for us to evolve that model. That's the challenge. And that's the challenge not for institutions, but it's a challenge for citizens. And people need to really claim back the authority that we have as individuals and the responsibility. If there's a problem going on, it's our problem. Yeah, I think that in Canadian society, that's a bigger question and challenge than it is in my own community, where we have not entrenched the feudal model where a, quote, chief or Lanas Au has the privilege and the power to say, I am authorized to do violence as we have in Canada. Basically, states we have given as citizens the rights for them to imprison and to punish and to go to war. I mean, that's a pretty heavy thing. That thing doesn't happen in Indigenous societies. And I think that's kind of a feature of a feudal structure where you have all this compressed power and authority at the top, and it's the power to do harm as well as is the power to do bad. You asked earlier about the Haida government model. That doesn't exist. You have to feed the people. You have to nourish the people. And that is why the support for Haida governance in Haida Gwaii is equally strong in the non-Indigenous communities. And the models that we have built there should be models applied elsewhere in Canada. And the reason why they aren't is a bunch of lawyers for the Ministry of Justice said that simply to acknowledge the existence of another governmental structure that is not based on the Westminster model and on the Queen of England at that time is dangerous. Anyways, that was a political rant, and there's much more around that whole issue, but I shake my head as an aging guy that the models that we had worked on back in the 80s and in the 90s are not applied elsewhere in this country because they're really, really progressive. They're based on consensus or consensus -1, not on the demands or the authority of the chair.
I mean, I think it's innovation that has brought us together today to talk about some of these political ideas that I didn't necessarily recognize that Manga could sort of, as a tool, kind of make happen in its way. And I think storytelling of Haida art certainly has a lot of things to say about, the ongoing relationship between Haida folks and us, and Haida folks and the government, and Haida folks and the world around you. So that's really great. And I also noticed that there was a 10-year gap between your first book, Red, and your second, Carpe Fin. Thank you. And Jaj has come out relatively soon, just a few years after Carpe Fin. Will there be a fourth book?
Yeah, I think you said earlier, the Vancouver Art Gallery have asked me to do a painting a similar size, 8 square meters. And there is going to be a fourth. I will finish the painting, I think, maybe by June. These are like about 2.5-year projects. And if Douglas and McIntyre are interested, we will produce another book following the same sort of template. But actually, they're big projects. And I'm kind of thinking maybe 4 is enough. There's other things I like to do. There's, as you said, we're working with the Vancouver and Pacific Opera companies, and Montreal wants to get aboard, and we're taking Flight of the Hummingbird, which is a Greystone publishing book, and flipping that out to an 1.5-hour opera. So, and there's just smaller paintings to do. I don't know if I want to commit 2.5 years again. I might not have 2.5 years left. I don't know. So yeah, there's going to be one more book. I suspect it will be out, I'm going to say September 25.
That's exciting. That's really great. Well, I guess I feel like I've learned a lot, and I have been able to pick up things that I'm going to be able to springboard off of as a result of chatting with you today. And I'm looking forward to seeing your work out in the wild whenever that happens next. And certainly now I'm looking forward to to the next book and to sort of seeing more, just more. It's a really valuable gift to have you creating this innovative sort of way of looking at history and commonalities between people. And I look forward to more. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.
Absolutely.
I know, I just want to say that I did come a little bit late, not long, maybe 4 or 5 minutes late. And so I thought, by way of apologizing to the audience, I'm going to give away some pens. I've got 4 pens from the studio. So as we line up to do book signing, the first 4 people, you're going to get a pen from the studio. Thank you for your patience.
Yes, and I need to also add that if you are interested in purchasing a copy, you can contact 32 Books to order them for you. So thank you all to the staff and to the volunteers at Word Vancouver for making this possible. There are plenty more events happening. Don't forget to check out a complete listing of those events at wordvancouver.ca. So thank you very much.